Every time the United States imposes economic sanctions, political leaders claim they are weaponizing America's strengths, using financial dominance to punish adversaries and force compliance. But if you look at the actual outcomes rather than the intended goals, you see something different, something that should deeply concern anyone who cares about American strategic interests. Sanctions are not weakening adversaries, they are accelerating the exact developments American policy claims to prevent. They are pushing countries toward alternative systems, driving technological independence, and creating precisely the multipolar order that American hegemony was designed to prevent. And nowhere is this pattern more visible than in the relationship between American sanctions and the rise of China and BRICS. I want to walk through this carefully because the mechanism is not obvious and the consequences are still unfolding. But once you understand how sanctions actually work and how target countries respond, the strategic failure becomes clear. Let me start with the basic logic of economic sanctions are supposed to impose costs that change behavior. If you cut a country off from American markets, American technology, or the dollar financial system, that country faces economic pain and adjusts its policies to regain access. This logic works when the sanctioned country has no alternatives, when American access is irreplaceable, and when the pain exceeds the value of whatever policy triggered the sanctions, but that set of conditions is becoming increasingly rare. And when those conditions do not hold, sanctions produce a very different outcome. They incentivize the target to build alternatives to reduce dependence and to create systems that bypass American control. This is not a hypothetical concern. This is exactly what is happening with China and BRICS. Let me show you the mechanism in specific domains. Financial infrastructure is the most obvious example. For decades, the United States used dollar dominance and control of SWIFT, the global financial messaging system, as tools of coercion. If you wanted to engage in international trade, you needed dollars and you needed access to dollar clearing systems. This gave Washington extraordinary leverage. Cutting countries off from SWIFT was economically devastating. Freezing dollar reserves was politically humiliating. Russia learned this lesson after 2014 when sanctions following Crimea cut Russian banks off from SWIFT and froze Russian assets. The immediate impact was severe, but the long-term response was exactly what strategic logic predicts. Russia began building alternatives. It created SPFS, its own financial messaging system. It established bilateral currency swap agreements to bypass dollar transactions. It accumulated gold reserves to reduce dollar dependence, and crucially, it started coordinating with China and other countries facing similar pressures. China was watching and learning. China had not been sanctioned at the same level as Russia, but Chinese leaders understood that dependence on dollar systems was strategic vulnerability. So China built CIP Prosper Interbank Payment System as an alternative to SWIFT. China established currency swap lines with over 40 countries, allowing bilateral trade without dollars. China began promoting the renminbi for international transactions and created digital yuan specifically designed for cross-border use. These systems were not initially competitive with dollar-denominated infrastructure, but they existed, and every time the United States used financial sanctions, more countries had reason to develop alternatives. This is where BRICS becomes relevant. BRICS, originally Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, was mostly a symbolic grouping countries with large populations and growing economies but limited coordination. American sanctions changed that Russia needed alternatives to Western financial systems. China wanted to reduce dollar dependence. Other emerging economies were frustrated with American-dominated institutions. BRICS became the platform for coordinating these alternative systems. In 2023, BRICS expanded, adding Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Iran. This was not random. These are countries that either face sanctions or want to reduce dependence on Western systems. The expanded BRICS now represents over 40% of global population and over 35% of global GDP, measured by purchasing power parity. More importantly, BRICS countries are actively building financial infrastructure that bypasses American control. Let me show you what this looks like in concrete terms. because abstractions obscure the reality of what is being built. The new development bank headquartered in Shanghai was capitalized with 100 billion. It has approved over 30 billion in projects across member countries. These are real infrastructure investments. Power plants in South Africa, roads in Brazil, renewable energy in India. The bank operates without the policy conditionality that the World Bank imposes no requirements for privatization, market liberalization, or governance reforms, just financing for projects that member governments prioritize. This makes NDB attractive to countries frustrated with IMF and World Bank conditions, and every successful project validates the model. BRICS countries are also expanding local currency trade at unprecedented scale. China and Russia now conduct over 90% of bilateral trade in rubles and renminbi. This represents approximately $200 billion annually that bypasses dollar systems. China and Brazil signed currency swap agreement worth 190 billion allowing direct trade without dollar intermediation. Brazilian soybean exports to China over $50 billion annually increasingly settle in renminbi or reais. This is not theoretical. These are actual transactions involving real commodities worth tens of billions. India and Russia are working on rupee-ruble trade mechanisms to avoid dollar sanctions. UAE has established renminbi clearing systems, making Dubai a hub for non-dollar trade. Saudi Arabia. Traditionally, the anchor of dollar dominance through petrodollar system is now accepting renminbi for oil sales to China. This is profoundly significant because oil priced in dollars created structural demand for dollars globally. When Saudi oil trades in renminbi, that structural advantage erodes, even small percentages matter. If 10% of global oil trade shifts from dollars to alternatives, that is hundreds of billions in reduced dollar demand annually, and the trend is growing, not shrinking. BRICS countries are also coordinating on technology standards. China's telecommunications standards are being adopted across BRICS countries. Brazil uses Huawei infrastructure. Russia uses Chinese satellites. India increasingly sources Chinese industrial equipment. These technology choices create lock-in effects once infrastructure is built around Chinese standards. Switching becomes expensive and it creates alternatives to Western technology ecosystems. When American companies are excluded from these markets through sanctions or policy, they lose not just current revenue, they lose future integration into technological systems that may become dominant in much of the world. Payment systems show similar coordination. Russia's Mir payment system now works in Turkey, Vietnam, and other countries. China's Union Pay is accepted in over 180 countries. These are alternatives to Visa and MasterCard, which can be sanctioned. Digital currencies are being coordinated. China's digital yuan is being tested for cross-border transactions with Thailand, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. Russia is developing digital ruble with similar cross-border capabilities. Brazil is implementing digital real. These central bank digital currencies can potentially bypass commercial banking systems that American sanctions target. This is financial infrastructure being built, specifically to operate independently of American oversight. Commodity trading platforms are also being developed. China has established oil futures contracts denominated in renminbi on Shanghai Exchange. Russia is creating commodity exchanges for metals and agricultural products that settle in rubles. These are alternatives to dollar-denominated trading on London and New York exchanges. The volumes are still small compared to established markets, but they are growing, and they prove viability. Shipping and logistics infrastructure reinforces these alternative systems. China's Belt and Road Initiative has built ports across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. These ports facilitate trade that bypasses traditional Western-controlled shipping routes and terminals. Pakistan's Gwadar Port, Sri Lanka's Hambento, Greece's Piraeus, Kenya's Mombasa, Chinese built and operated, creating logistics networks that do not depend on Western infrastructure. This matters because control of logistics is control of trade flows. When American sanctions try to block trade, if the ports, rails, and roads are Chinese built and operated, enforcement becomes difficult. BRICS countries are also coordinating on food security. Russia is the world's largest wheat exporter. Brazil is dominant in soybeans. India is major rice producer. Together, these countries can feed much of the world without depending on American or European agricultural exports. This gives them leverage in negotiations and reduces vulnerability to food weaponization. We saw previews of this when Russia restricted wheat exports and prices spiked globally. Imagine BRICS coordinating on agricultural policy. The leverage would be enormous, and American sanctions are precisely what drives this kind of coordination. Energy infrastructure shows deepening integration. Russia supplies oil and gas to China and India at discounted prices. Pipelines connect Russian fields to Chinese markets, avoiding maritime routes that could be interdicted. China is building renewable energy capacity that reduces oil dependence. But in transition period, Russian supplies provide energy security. This creates mutual dependence that strengthens both countries' positions against Western pressure. Technology transfer within BRICS is accelerating. China shares manufacturing expertise with Brazil and South Africa. Russia provides space and nuclear technology to India and China. India supplies pharmaceutical and IT services across BRICS. This is not just trade, it is building collective technological capacity that reduces dependence on Western technology. And critically, it is creating alternative innovation ecosystems. When Chinese, Indian, and Brazilian researchers collaborate, they create knowledge networks independent of Western academic systems. This long-term capacity building is more threatening to American technological dominance than any short-term sanctions impact. Now look at technology where the same pattern repeats. The United States imposed semiconductor sanctions on China, cutting off access to advanced chips and manufacturing equipment. This was opposed to Chinese technological development, especially in artificial intelligence. Instead, it accelerated Chinese investment in domestic alternatives. China is now pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into semiconductor research, manufacturing capacity, and alternative architectures. Chinese companies are developing chips using mature processes that do not require the most advanced equipment. They are exploring alternative computing paradigms that do not depend on cutting-edge semiconductors. They are building entire ecosystems of suppliers and partners in countries that do not enforce American restrictions. This is massively expensive and will take years, but it is happening. And once China achieves technological independence, American leverage disappears permanently. Sanctions do not stop Chinese technological development. They just ensure that development happens outside American influence. The same logic applies to telecommunications. American sanctions on Huawei were supposed to isolate the company and prevent Chinese dominance in 5G. Instead, Huawei doubled down on international markets that do not enforce American restrictions. Huawei now dominates 5G deployment across Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and parts of Europe. These are markets where American companies are effectively absent, not because they cannot compete, but because they did not prioritize these regions. American sanctions did not stop Huawei. They redirected Huawei toward markets where Chinese technology becomes the default standard. Once that standard is established and local infrastructure is built around it, reversing course becomes prohibitively expensive. This is how technological ecosystems form, not through superior technology alone, but through installed base network effects and switching costs. American policy is ensuring that these ecosystems form around Chinese technology in much of the developing world. Now consider energy markets where sanctions are producing similar dynamics. American sanctions on Russian oil and gas were supposed to punish Russia and force energy diversification. Instead, they accelerated integration between Russia and China. Russia redirected exports from Europe to Asia. China increased purchases of Russian energy at discounted prices. This benefits both countries. Russia maintains revenue. China secures supply at favorable terms. And critically, these transactions increasingly bypass dollar systems. Energy trade has historically been denominated in dollars. This created structural demand for dollars and gave the United States leverage over global energy flows. But as Russia and China conduct energy trade in rubles and rend minimal advantage, Erotis other energy exporters are watching this dynamic. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other Gulf states are exploring non-dollar energy trade with China and other buyers. This is not because they oppose the United States. It is because they see strategic benefit in diversifying away from exclusive dollar dependence. American sanctions are teaching energy exporters that dollar dependence is political risk. Once that lesson is learned, it cannot be unlearned. The pattern extends to commodities more broadly. Russia, Brazil, and other BRICS countries are major exporters of agricultural products, minerals, and metals. Historically, these commodities traded in dollars through Western-dominated exchanges and logistics. But sanctions and payment restrictions are incentivizing alternative arrangements. China now purchases Brazilian soybeans, Russian wheat, and South African minerals through bilateral arrangements that bypass traditional dollar-denominated markets. These trades are smaller and less efficient initially than dollar markets, but they create precedent and infrastructure for non-dollar commerce, and every successful trade makes the next one easier. This is how alternative systems gain traction, not through sudden displacement, but through gradual accumulation of transactions that prove viability. Institutional architecture shows the same pattern. American-dominated institutions, the IMF, World Bank, and WTO, have historically set rules for global economic governance. But American use of these institutions for political purposes has undermined their legitimacy when the IMF imposes harsh conditions on countries in crisis while being lenient toward American allies, when the World Bank prioritizes American political objectives over development effectiveness, when the WTO is paralyzed by American refusal to appoint judges. These institutions lose credibility as neutral arbiters and countries seek alternatives. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, created by China, now has over 100 members, including most American allies. The new development bank provides financing without Western conditions. Regional trade agreements bypass WTO paralysis. These institutions do not replace American-dominated structures, but they provide alternatives that reduce dependence. And once alternatives exist, American institutional leverage weakens significantly. Now, here is the crucial point that American policymakers seem to miss. None of this is happening because China and BRICS are superior systems. It is happening because American sanctions create powerful incentives to build alternatives. Every sanction, every threatened sanction, every weaponization of dollar access validates the decision to reduce American exposure. Countries that might otherwise have been content with dollar-denominated trade and American institutional participation now see these as strategic vulnerabilities. And once you see dependency as vulnerability, you invest in alternatives. This is exactly how the Soviet bloc formed during the Cold War. American policy treated the Soviet Union as an adversary to isolate, so the Soviet Union built alternative systems. Comcon for economic integration, Warsaw Pact for security. These systems were inefficient and ultimately unsustainable, but they existed and they reduced Soviet dependence on Western systems. American sanctions policy is repeating this pattern, but this time the countries building alternatives. China, India, Brazil have far more economic capability, far more technological sophistication, and far more integration into global commerce. This makes the alternative systems they are building far more viable and far more threatening to American interests. The BRICS system that is emerging is not anti-American in ideological terms. It is post-American in structural terms. It assumes that American approval is not necessary for international commerce, that dollar access is optional, not required, and that American institutions can be supplemented or bypassed. This is profoundly threatening to American power because American hegemony has always depended on centrality, not just dominance. Countries participated in American-led systems not because they had to, but because those systems provided the most efficient way to engage globally. But when American policy weaponizes that centrality, it creates incentives to build alternatives. And once alternatives exist, centrality erodes. This is the doom loop. American policy is creating imposed sanctions to punish adversaries. Build alternatives to reduce exposure. Alternatives attract other countries seeking to reduce dependence. American centrality diminishes. American leverage weakens. American policy responds with more sanctions cycle continues. And with each iteration, American position weakens, not strengthens. This is not happening because American power has suddenly collapsed. It is happening because American policy is systematically undermining the structural advantages that created American power. Dollar dominance, technological leadership, institutional centrality. These were not given by geography or destiny. They were built through decades of policy that made American systems the most attractive option. But weaponizing those systems makes them less attractive, and less attractive eventually means less dominant China. And BRICS are not overthrowing American hegemony. They are simply providing alternatives that American policy is making increasingly attractive. This is the great irony of current American strategy. It is designed to preserve American dominance, but it is accelerating the transition to multipolarity. Every sanction, every restriction, every weaponization moves the world one step further from dollar dependence, from American technological centrality, from American institutional dominance. And this transition is probably irreversible because once countries invest in alternatives, once they prove viable, once they achieve scale, going back becomes economically irrational. Even if American policy reverses course, even if sanctions are lifted, the incentive to maintain alternatives remains because the lesson learned is that American systems can be weaponized at any time. That lesson cannot be unlearned. So countries will maintain redundancy and optionality even if relationships normalize. This means American policy is creating structural change that will outlast any policy reversal. The multipolar order that is emerging, the BRICS systems that are forming, the dollar alternatives being built. These are permanent features of future global economy, not because they are better than American systems, but because American policy made them necessary. This is how hegemony ends, not through defeat, but through self-inflicted strategic erosion, where tools of dominance become sources of weakness, where attempts to coerce compliance produce coordinated resistance, where sanctions intended to punish adversaries accelerate the very developments they were designed to prevent. And we are watching this process unfold in real time, with every new sanction package, with every threatened restriction, with every assertion of dollar weaponization. American policy validates the BRICS alternative and pushes the world one step further toward the post-American order that American strategy is supposedly designed to prevent.